Today we come to the seventh commandment, and as we do that, we're going to be exploring the commandment to not commit adultery. The fact that this has to be one of the top 10 commandments tells us that in the ancient world, this was a serious issue just like it is today. So we often think that we live in this hyper-sexualized era, and we do. But you know, this was a struggle for the people in the ancient Egyptian times. It was a struggle for the Israelites who were set free from slavery. This is a struggle, our human struggle with our sexual desires, our drives, and relationships that bring harm to other people. So we're going to explore that in this session today. But before we do that, I want to take you back to Egypt. And I want to take you back to just south of Luxor, actually just south of the Valley of the Kings, is a temple. It's on the back side of that. It's a temple that is one of the wonders of ancient Egypt. It's Hatshepsut's temple, her funerary temple. And Hatshepsut was one of the first, if not the first, female pharaohs. Now, typically the pharaohs were men. So what happened when she becomes pharaoh is she has to be transformed into a man. And so she goes into a room, the priests pray, there's a certain liturgy that happens, and when she comes out, while she still looks like a female, she has in essence become a male. There is something interesting that's happening in this story. And she builds this temple as a place to remember her in her death. And I want you to have a chance to see it. I don't want you to miss it. And I want to take you there now so you can see Hatshepsut's temple. Standing in front of Hatshepsut's temple, which is just the other side of the Valley of the Kings. And here we have the temple that was built by Hatshepsut. She was one of the few female rulers over Egypt. Born in 1507, she died in 1458. The next ruler, after the pharaoh had died, the next ruler was only 4 years old. And so she had ruled alongside her husband, and instead of turning the kingdom over to a 4-year-old, which was violating the rules, the priest decided to turn it over, at her encouragement, to Hatshepsut, which was also a violation of the rules. In order for her to continue to rule as pharaoh, once the 4-year-old became 8, old enough to rule over Egypt, the requirement was that she build a temple to Hathor. And as she built the temple to Hathor, there was a regeneration room in the temple. She went in the regeneration room, and after spending the night there, when she emerged, it was said that she became a man. So she was still in the body of a woman, but she became a man, and she is now said to have permission to rule over the kingdom or the empire of Egypt. And so she becomes the pharaoh of Egypt, one of the few female pharaohs. We're going to go inside and take a look, and then we'll talk a little more about how this connects with Moses. Depending on when we date Moses, she either is, some have said she was the princess who pulled Moses out of the river Nile, or she lived before his time if we give a late dating to Moses. But it's an interesting, what you see here was built somewhere around the time of Moses, before or during the time of Moses. I suggest probably way before the time of Moses, within 100 years of that. But let's go take a look. So here again at the temple of Hatshepsut, you have a chance to see the mountains up above into which this temple was carved. And then below what you find is the altar. And so there were steps on the one side. Animals would be offered as sacrifice on the altar. And this gives you a sense of what the temple of Jerusalem was like, and the altar in which the priests would offer their sacrifices. It was, the ideas were used throughout the ancient Middle East or ancient Near East. And you have a chance to see what that looked like here as people would offer their sacrifices to the Egyptian gods. So while there are not lots of connections I want to draw from the Temple of Hatshepsut to the Ten Commandments, I wanted you to have a chance to see this. Since we are in Egypt, I thought you'd really need to see this. Many of you will never be here, and I thought you might enjoy having a chance to see this magnificent temple, one of the wonders, one of the treasures, really, of ancient Egypt. I find Hatshepsut's temple absolutely astounding. Now, behind me, you see the sun setting on the west side of the Nile. You see the Nile River, and you see the mountain there. It's at the base of that mountain where Hatshepsut's temple is found. But you see here next to me the goddess Sekhmet. Sekhmet is portrayed as a lioness, and she is the daughter of Ra, and she is fierce. Like a lioness, she is fierce, and she brings the wrath of the gods upon those who have violated the moral commandments, like you shall not commit adultery. And so she brings plagues and other acts of judgment. But if you obey the laws, if you follow the commandments, you obey the moral laws in Egypt, then and you offer her sacrifices, she becomes the domesticated cat the goddess Bastet. And there she is your companion, and she cares for you and protects you and watches over you. So I want us to think together as we ponder her role in bringing wrath upon the Egyptians. I want us to think together about God's command for us not to be with someone else's spouse. And to talk about this, I want to go back to our conversation with Rabbi Art Nemitov. Let's join that conversation once more. Well, let's talk about adultery. So the commandment seems pretty straightforward. What did it mean in the ancient world, or was it read any differently in the ancient world, or did it apply differently in the ancient world? And why is this commandment important for us today?
Well, adultery means that you do not take something that belongs to another person in terms of property. And in days gone by, women, sadly, were seen as pieces of property that were bought and sold, bought by the husband and sold by the father. Thank God today that's not the world that we live in. But as a result, when you commit adultery, you're taking something that doesn't belong to you. And I believe that's how it can be viewed today. That adultery is the most intimate of the marriage relationship, or the partner relationship is the most intimate of relationships. And when you violate that, you're violating that connectedness. So going back to that parallel, ours is do not worship another god, do not make idols for yourself. That equals adultery. When we say you shall not commit adultery, we're saying that the marriage relationship or the partner relationship is unique and special. So too do we believe that it parallels the idea of worshiping only one God. Our relationship is with one God. Our commitment is to one God. So too should our partner or marriage relationship be with one individual, not with more than one. And that's the connection between the two.
As human beings, we struggle with our sexuality. I mean, the reality is that not a single one of us, put in the wrong set of circumstances, couldn't find ourselves doing something that we would later regret. We have both a sin drive and a sex drive, and these two work together to lead us to think things we shouldn't think, to say things we shouldn't say, and sometimes to do things we shouldn't do. And this commandment is reminding us that we are called to monitor our minds and our hearts. And what Jesus teaches us once more, he turns it on its head or makes it even harder. He says it's not just about what you do, it's about what you think. And so we have to train our minds. We have to ask for his help to train our minds to be able to focus on what's right and good and to bless and not to harm other people, not to do things that are putting us at the center of the world and taking what doesn't really belong to us or giving ourselves to someone when we really belong to someone else. So I want to encourage you to, as you think about this, in our hypersexualized society, it's really hard to follow this commandment. And not just the way Moses had said it. I think, I've never violated this commandment when it came to being with another woman besides my wife. But the thoughts that come into our minds, that's just a part of life in the world we live in. We're surrounded by this. And so what I want to remind you of is we're called to have holy thoughts. We're called to live our lives and to have our hearts and our minds focused on the right and not the wrong, to be faithful even in the inner thought life. But I also want to remind you of this, that when a woman was brought to Jesus who was caught in the very act of adultery, as I mentioned in the book, and the righteous men, the Pharisees, the keepers of the law, came and they brought their stones to stone her because the law commanded that if you were caught in the act of adultery, you were to be stoned to death. And remember, they brought her to Jesus. Where was the man? They didn't pay attention to whatever happened to the man. They brought the woman to Jesus, and they threw her at Jesus' feet. And I love this in John chapter 8, this story that circulated as an independent fragment for a very long time before it was inserted into the Gospel of John. They came to Jesus and they said, Jesus, what do you think? She was caught in the act of adultery, and they were trying to set up a trap for him where he would disobey the law by setting her free because they knew she was merciful to people who had violated the commandments. And they have their stones in their hands, ready to stone her to death. I picture her weeping and shaking in fear, not even looking up. And you remember Jesus kneels down and he begins to write on the dirt. And then he looks up at them and he says this, the one of you who has never sinned, you cast the first stone. And one by one, they all dropped their stones and walked away. And then he turned to the woman and he lifted her up and he said, woman, where are your accusers? Neither do I condemn thee, but go and sin no more. I want you to hear this, that every one of these commandments calls us to a high moral standard. But along with that is how Jesus actually practiced ministry, which was to be rich in mercy. And so if you've blown it in this area, I invite you simply to call upon Christ and invite him to show you mercy, to wash you clean and to make you new. And I invite all of us to say, Lord, please help me in my secret thought life and in my actions to honor you. Would you pray with me? Lord, how grateful we are that you are rich in mercy and abounding in steadfast love. How grateful also that you call us to such high standards, that you ask us to be able to focus our minds and our hearts in the right place, to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And that means not to take advantage of someone who is not our spouse, to be faithful to our spouse. And, oh Lord, to be careful what we put into our hearts and our minds. You know how we struggle, oh God, in this hypersexualized world we live in. Please help us to be faithful to one another, to be faithful to you. And when we have failed in any part of our lives, we ask for you to forgive us, to wash us clean, and make us new. In your holy name, amen.